my name is Josh White, and this is Globalists, the new podcast from the battleground. Once again, the UK has a new Prime Minister. Some hope that Andy Burnham will breathe new life into the Labour Party and bring some stability to UK politics as a whole. But others are much more sceptical, even though there are hopes that Burnham might take a slightly better line on certain things, especially Palestine and Israel and the British relationship with the United States. And joining me to discuss this is my co-host Mitchell Plitnick.
Yeah, hi Josh. So I can't express enough how glad I am to see Keir Starmer out of 10 Downing Street. His even for those of us not living in the UK, his term has been disastrous. In many ways, it's even worse, I think, than a conservative, than a right wing uh, PM, just because it's so ineffectual, and I think so also hypocritical. It was so striking, his background as a human rights lawyer, and then being this I mean, just literally advocating for war crimes in Gaza, which I think in many ways sums Starmer up. But Andy Burnham is, at least for me as a non UK person, is a bit of a mystery, and so I'm hoping we're going to find out, and I'm hoping to hear from you a little bit more about what's realistic to expect from him. I don't have super high hopes, but I certainly expect him to be better than Starmer. But anxious to have this conversation.
Sure, I get where you're coming from. I'm very much in the school of thought that was against Starmer from the beginning, before it was fashionable. So I'm very happy to see him go. And the Burnham era, which is only like it's barely a week old, really, is unfolding before our eyes. And there are positive signs and there are negative signs. I'm trying to be kind of open-minded about this, as opposed to forming a negative point of view from the outset, as some people have on the left. Although I think that that's understandable given the history of Labour governments. What we know about Burnham's record is that he's changed a lot over time. Um, some people read that as him flip-flopping or just going with the changing weather of politics. I think it's probably more so the case that he has actually developed his own views over time. When you look at someone who's been in politics for 25 years, he went from being very much a New Labour figure, a machine man, really. Worked for Gordon Brown's Treasury, and was in his cabinet. But he became more of his own man in the last 10 years or so. He did not join the kind of putsch against Corbyn in 2016, despite standing against Corbyn in 2015, for example. He left Parliament to become Mayor of Manchester and ran as a fairly effective progressive mayor, adapting to that role fairly well, given he could have taken a more neoliberal approach. He responded to local campaigning from groups like Momentum and Acorn. He brought the bus services into public control, which is something that has basically cemented his reputation in Manchester, among many other things, to be fair, but that's the big thing that he's known for. So we come to his kind of premiership as well, we come to it in a very different way to the Starmer era, I think. This is why there's some degree of popularity that's stronger in Burnham's case than there was in the case of Starmer, where his popularity was short-lived and ultimately very flimsy. We'll see if Burnham can actually build on his kind of early bounce, as it's being characterized. it's possible it's just a honeymoon. Um, but this is kind of the important background, I think, before we can like discuss his positioning right now. Um,
Well, I think one of the things that I know a lot of people have noticed is his installation. Well, replacing David Lammy with Ed Miliband. Um, I think in terms of foreign policy, I read that Miliband is far from a firebrand leftist or anything like that, but I do see Miliband as somebody who has a very pragmatic, sensible, maybe even one might say realist, but in a more positive way, approach to foreign policy. Um, he is not somebody I expect to, you know, I mean, he's staked out certain positions, opposing, for example, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. But he's also been pretty clear about holding Israel to at least some degree of accountability, which is rare in labor. When we look at who was guiding Starmer's policy on Israel Palestine, I mean, it was Labor Friends of Israel was just everywhere you looked, and there's still, from what I can tell in the cabinet, still a good deal of that in there, but that does not include Miliband, and it does not. It doesn't quite permeate the cabinet in the same way that it did under Starmer. I think part of it is we're hoping, especially in this time, right, that Burnham will recognize the shifting winds of politics around Israel and Palestine, and that he'll act just in accordance. I mean, few people are expecting anything more than acting in accordance with human rights norms and international law, but that's a huge step from where we've always been. And I don't see Burnham doing, going quite that far. It seems to me more likely that he's going to want to uh, make Israel and Palestine as little of a problem for him as possible. And that does mean a bit of a break from Starmer, but um, yeah, I mean, I certainly don't. I don't see either the the really big turnaround that I've seen a few people kind of hope for, or I also don't see quite. At least it doesn't look to me like quite as horrible a future as some on the left who just seem to think that it's going to be a continuation of the Starmer policy. I think that's going too far. I do think Burnham recognizes, if nothing else, that Starmer's policy on Palestine was a political disaster for labor. And I think he does not want to repeat that. So I think there's some hope there, but you tell me.
yeah, I think that there are positive signs on this front insofar as Burnham has, for example, made an apology for Labour's positioning over Gaza, which you could easily say is insufficient, and that the key question is what he does in actual policy. That's not unfair, but it is a interesting signal, I think, and a significant departure from the Starmer era, in which any kind of criticism of Israel was framed as anti-Semitic or in some way suspect, and the entire kind of question of Gaza was framed almost as if it was almost obscene to talk about. And as some people have said, half jokingly, there might be less hippie punching under Burnham than there was under Starmer. Um, of course, the appointment of Miliband is probably the most interesting one out of the entire cabinet because Miliband was touted as a possible chancellor. That was very much railed against by big oil and weirdly by some sections of the trade union movement, actually. Um,
Why was
Mil-
that?
because a certain portion of the union movement fears that his kind of net zero commitments would threaten jobs in the UK. It's actually the evidence behind it is extremely shaky, of course,
Hmm, okay.
because actually Miliband's policies around environmental technology and so on has actually created more jobs than it's then it's killed off. But that's a bit of a tangent. Um, him getting the Foreign Office is a very interesting move, and I think it does send in a signal towards realism in a more progressive sense, certainly of a restrained foreign policy. It'll be more legalistic, ironically, because of course he's inheriting the brief from, well, originally Lammy, there was Yvette Cooper in between, but the shift from lawyers to Miliband is kind of a funny one because it's probably going to result in a more restrained, legalistic approach to foreign affairs. And Miliband's own history on this, and as you know, yes, he's somewhat critical of Israel, but also kind of a liberal Zionist. And his previous positioning in foreign policy was noteworthy, especially on Syria in 2013. It's often talked about as if Miliband stopped a humanitarian intervention or he stopped an invasion of Syria. The truth is more complicated, but also more banal. Miliband put forward a, again, legalistic motion, uh, essentially opposing the Tory position on procedural grounds. And the Tory government lost its vote, but the Labour motion also failed. So it's actually a cancelling out of both positions. But the result was Britain didn't jump in headfirst in 2013. So to that extent, we can say that Miliband has a sensible kind of restraint on the foreign policy side, even if it isn't particularly what should we say radical, isn't isn't particularly based in, I don't know, big ideas about a moral foreign policy or whatever.
Yeah.
But the main thing is that he's not going to just join a series of forever wars. Of course, the problem is there are forever wars. We can get to that in a minute, I
Yeah.
guess.
We can't. Before we do though, and I
Yeah,
do want to get to that. But before
sure.
we get to that, you mentioned about you mentioned something about Burnham being less likely to what was it, I forget the phrase you used, punch the hippies, um,
Yes.
which actually I think bears on one of the things that I'm going to be watching the closest, because I think it has ramifications for us here in the U.S. and also in the rest of Europe, which is how Burnham is going to approach the question of Palestine action. Um,
Mm,
that now, so far, it doesn't seem like, at least from what I can tell, that he intends to really make any changes on that front. And the fact that he retained Shabana Mahmoud as the Home Secretary seems to indicate, yeah, that he is not going to change anything there. But it seems like that would be the best place for him to change it. It's an issue that I would imagine going in a different direction would anger perhaps labor friends of Israel, but I would imagine would go a long way toward healing the rift with the labor left that is increasingly going towards the Greens, which I'm not sure I want to see that rift healed, but if I was Burnham, I would, and I certainly want to see this whole concept of a group like Palestine Action being treated as terrorists. This is a global precedent that I think is extremely dangerous, especially considering some of the things that we're seeing happening here in the states these days. The Trump administration is has just literally declared war
yeah.
on left wing organizations using uh, a memo that's a year old now, and Trump kind of let lie until now when he's really starting to put it into action. So I guess that would be my question. Is there any chance that Burnham might? It seems like it would be politically advantageous for him to change course on Palestine action. I think that would matter for everyone, but again, like I said, retaining Mahmoud kind of implies that he won't.
I think it's going to be contingent upon left pressure, and I think Burnham is more open to it than Starmer was, although he is being very evasive on on this question. In fact, he was asked about it by journalists when he was marching through Euston Station towards victory. Palestine action was one of the things that people shouted at him, and he just didn't respond. I think he wants clean hands on these issues, which is going to be very difficult for him to maintain. But that means that he's quite vulnerable to left pressure potentially, especially because I think he really is looking at the threat of the Greens and thinking we need to defeat them. We need to win back those voters. And I think that there are some Labour strategists behind him who hate the left, but they see the prospect of Labour disappearing in the not too distant future, and they're terrified by that.
as
Yeah.
well they should be.
Yes.
They can look. They want to look over in the direction of Palestine. They can look and see what happened to the Israeli Labor Party,
Yeah.
which has in fact disappeared. It was once the hegemonic party for a long time, for decades in Israel, and now it no longer effectively no longer exists. So technically, it still does. Um, so hopefully they can see that. But let's switch over to what you were saying about sort of the more global look on foreign policy, because one of the things that is really, and we may get to discuss this in future episodes, I'm sure it'll be an ongoing issue, is we know that one of the things Starmer was praised for, although I don't know how you feel, I think we're on the same page on this, don't necessarily think of it as a positive, but many people praise Starmer for his handling of the Ukraine issue. Um, and it's not 100% clear where Burnham's going on that, but Burnham certainly seems to still support Ukraine. But I think that's about to get a lot more complicated. Ukraine, uh, as everyone out there probably knows by now, recently attacked an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea, killing an Iranian sailor. In my view, and this is, I'll say it's my view, it's not universally shared, but in my view, this is an attempt to bring the United States directly, is to connect the two wars, the Ukraine war and the Iran war, thereby bringing the United States to the place that Zelensky has wanted from the very beginning, which is a direct involvement in the war against Russia, direct U.S., not just money and weapons, but direct U.S. participation, which probably implies direct European participation as well. So we're potentially talking World War III here, and it given that makes perfect sense from the Ukrainian point of view. I mean that's how they would win a war against Russia. It's what they've never been able to even dream of, and something that Trump has already, I think, demonstrated pretty clearly that if you kind of lead him along, he's stupid enough to follow, where most world leaders would not be, and that's going to make for a tricky situation now for Burnham, even if he faces elections relatively soon. I think his time at 10 Downing is going to be very much taken up with this question of how he approaches that, and uh, how determined he is to either keep the UK out of direct confrontation with Russia or is willing to go along with the Americans. And so, you know, I guess
Yeah.
throwing that open for you here.
Yeah, I think on this front, it's very clear that Burnham stands for a continuity position on Ukraine, particularly because he's backing all of the same talking points. He's appointed a hawk as chancellor
Yeah.
in terms of beefing up British militarism, and that's going to be a contradiction with a more restrained Foreign Office potentially. It's also the case that, as you pointed out, that we're potentially looking at Ukraine and Iran becoming a kind of unified conflict, which is a
Yeah.
terrifying prospect. I don't think I don't think he has a strategy for that, but no viable British leader has a strategy around that. On the Iran war, he has signed off on uh, the US using British bases, which was Starmer's position as well. But he is going to probably keep the British out of that conflict, at least in terms of direct participation. The contradictions between these things are going to play out, and it could be very, very bad. But he's also talking about we need to be able to tell Trump no sometimes, and we need to stand up to the Americans sometimes. Again, I will believe that when I see it.
Yeah.
I'm very skeptical about that. He tends to say some of the right things, but saying the right things isn't the same as doing the right things. And the structural reasons why Britain is so in hoc to the United States are very serious at this point. It's not just a simple matter of unwinding this stuff in a speech. Let's say can't be done overnight.
But that sort of raises the question of where, like his cabinet is going to be pushing him, right? So
Yeah,
on the one hand, I do think this is a place, the fact that he's going to be, perhaps, I mean, I may be wrong about this, but the fact that he may be put in a position where he has to decide for the UK whether they're going to follow the United States into a very complicated situation that could lead to global conflict, a true global conflict that we would honestly call World War III. Um, and I think that's where I'm glad to see somebody like Ed Miliband in as foreign secretary. He is a sober thinker. He's a smart man. He understands strategy, and he will think things through. What conclusions he comes to, we will see, and he has whatever predilections and biases that he might bring to that, but he will come to sober conclusions. I'm but then I look over at the new defense minister in West Streeling, right, who, as a long time uh, uh, labor friends of Israel person, but seems recently to have at least tried to modify that position publicly, or given some indication that maybe he's rethinking what has been a pretty strong devotion to the pro-Israel kind of labor community. So I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. I'd like to think there is a little bit of hope there, given the gravity of the situation, that he's a man who maybe saw Israel as a good political vehicle and now is maybe rethinking that. I would like to think that, but I honestly, I'm not familiar enough with him to know. So where do you see West Streeling kind of pushing Burnham going forward?
I generally have a very low opinion of West Streeting. However, what's interesting about this is that we have the leaked emails and WhatsApp messages between him and Peter Mandelson, and in
Exactly.
those, he expresses surprising views on the subject. I read I read his comments as strategic. He's repivoting. He's also just looking at his own constituency where he was nearly taken out by a pro Gaza
Right.
candidate who came within hundreds of votes of taking the seat from him. So he's got that in the back of his mind, but he's also looking at the reality of polling on the subject and the way the Greens are eating into Labour's base more broadly, and he's looking at what Israel is doing and the impact it's having across the West in terms of public support and thinking. I think he's probably seeing the writing on the wall to pick a cliche. It's quite striking though in those comments that Mandelson views him as being immature for even considering we have to change our position on Palestine.
I mean, that kind of speaks well of Streeting, doesn't it?
Yes, yes. So I think the contradictions there are very interesting. You have Streeting, a Blairite, one of the last, you know, believing Blairites, as you might call them, left really, in a position in the cabinet which gives him operational authority and influence over over the armed forces, and he's changing his views on Israel Palestine, albeit for plausibly cynical reasons. It's a good thing if it leads to the right policy results. And this is why I've emphasized there is an opening here for left pressure, and we on the left have to push this as far as we can.
I mean, that would seem to then raise kind of a tactical question, wouldn't it?
Hmm.
Um, because clearly, one of the things people in labor have to be hoping for with Burnham is that he will stop the bleeding to the left of support for labor that has been going to the Greens because Starmer has frankly been such a disaster. And foreign policy probably isn't the place that matters the most. Clearly, but I guess the question is how much should people think in terms of sort of pressure from within labor as opposed to pressure from outside, or the Greens and independent and other left wing groups. I mean, obviously, everybody in all of those places is going to do that, but how much should people also be thinking about, do they want to try and elevate the Greens
Hmm.
into the new sort of standard bearer of the British left, or do they want to try and bring Labour, I would argue for the first time, really, into a truly left wing position?
Yeah, my thinking around this is that we need extra parliamentary and to some extent intra-parliamentary pressure. By intra-parliamentary, I would say primarily the Greens. If you can get Labour MPs on side to take take strong positions in Parliament, fine, but they've proven to be quite ineffectual, frankly. I think a force outside the Labour Party is necessary to extract concessions, and that means people marching in terms of social movements, but it also means backing the Green Party across the country. And that's still my point of view, even though I'm not a total partisan for the Greens either. But I'm very much against this idea that we all should just fold ourselves into the Labour Party and try to influence them internally. I think the prospects for that are very much an illusion. You're talking about a very closed down machine. It's you could describe it as an internal dictatorship, frankly, because of the way it operates in terms of it's going after dissenters. Some listeners might find that a bit hard to believe, but if you look at the compliance mechanisms, you look at the rule book, you'll see they've removed natural justice from proceedings explicitly. It actually says that in the rule book. You can see through the compliance procedures that they go after people on all kinds of things and use any kind of mechanism they can to suspend people and remove them. I remember when Starmer was first instigating his purge and there were attempts to have a no confidence motion put forward, and many CLPs tried to put this forward. Anyone who put it forward was suspended automatically. And the rules that they were using to do that were under safe space rules. They were claiming it was making CLPs unsafe for Jewish members. Ironically, they removed a lot of Jews on these grounds, of course. Um, so that tells you a lot about the character, the internal character of the Labour Party. And Burnham may be a nicer guy than Starmer, and he definitely is, but the Labour Party is still the Labour Party, and it's not a party that's been designed by him.
Is there? I mean, that's a. I can't help but wonder if Burnham is going to try and kind of reach out leftward as a. I would think as a fig leaf, which I think this person would see through. But would he try and reach out to try and bring Jeremy Corbyn back into the party? Um, I've heard some people speculate about that. It seems unlikely to me that Corbyn would want to do that, um, given everything that's happened, and also given the fact that so many of his comrades have been expunged from the party as well. I don't think he would come back on his own. If he could bring his whole wing back, I think maybe we would see something like that. But that would be, I think, that would be a much more dramatic process. Anyway, do you think? I almost said Miliband. Do you think Burnham might? Uh, because as you mentioned, Burnham was not supportive of the purge, and he was not one of the people who got on board with the whole, as we're seeing happening here in the states right now, being echoed as I knew it would be, using these false accusations of anti-Semitism to scare the hell out of Jews who are important constituents here of the Democratic Party, as they are in the UK of Labour. Um, uh, but Burnham wasn't part of that. So might he reach out to Corbyn to try and bring him back in?
I think it's unlikely, though Burnham has talked about readmitting people who've been removed and driven out of the party. He's certainly open to certain people who've been driven out. I'm thinking of Jamie Driscoll and Faiza Shaheen, for example, who are less, uh, for the PLP, less controversial figures, let's say. I think the get out clause on Corbyn will be that he's founded a party, and by founding another party, that rules him out of rejoining. Um, I think that will be the kind of justification for it. Whether or not Corbyn decides to try and fold himself and his party back into Labour is another matter, but I think that will be difficult, politically very difficult, and I hope he doesn't try to do it.
I would imagine it would be almost impossible given the disdain for labor that exists in his party. So, but it was just something I wondered, because while I don't necessarily, I would not necessarily want to see Corbyn back in labor. I would want to see some of the people, Corbyn himself, and some of the people in his camp, uh, contributing to the discourse around how to handle, because I think the UK is about to face a, going back to what I mentioned earlier about this potential for, bringing the Ukraine and Iran wars together. Um, this is a minefield. It is a very it's a very, very difficult, I think, it's going to be a very, very difficult matter for any prime minister to navigate, any government to navigate. There's going to be a lot of pressure from the Americans. There's going to be pressure, obviously, from the Israelis, and therefore from the Jewish community in the UK, the wider pro-Israel community in the UK, for more hawkish stances. But there's also, I think, going to be a real concern as the conflict grows. I think all over the world, all over Europe, all over the United States, I think there will start to be questions. People will start questioning this notion that we can stay out of it. It will become, as it looks more and more like a global conflict. I think people will ask more and more, can we afford to stay out of it? Can we? Is it really, the safer course to stay out? Um, and I think that's going to be particularly pertinent for Europe, because I think the United States is stupid enough to jump in feet first, if the situation is right, and regardless of what the people of the United States think about that. Just as it jumped into the Iran war, regardless of what the people of the United States thought about that as well. So that's going to be a very, very tricky thing for Europe, and I think the more good minds in both Europe and the UK that are thinking about that, and trying to strategize around it, I think the better. It's only starting to develop now, which kind of implies that now is the time to start thinking through those strategies.
Yeah, I see all of this coming down the road, and I think the Burnham government is probably very unprepared for it. That's my that's my read on that. Um, the wider left in Britain is looking at it, but whether or not they will be able to kind of galvanize people is another matter. Um, the Greens are the Greens are thinking about all of this stuff, I think, behind closed doors. um, uh, in relationship to the climate crisis, especially, of course. But they're also thinking about these forever wars, and it's not clear what their strategy is either, to be honest with you. I think there's a lack of political strategy from the Polanski leadership on these matters, even if the media game is strong.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
What about on the right? I mean, where this will be. I mean, these are obviously going to be big national decisions. I don't think Burnham can ignore uh, what's left of the conservatives and also the growing influence of reform on this, forgetting about the domestic issues that where there's these intense disagreements. When we talk about questions that are going to be framed in terms of national security, I don't think Burnham can ignore those. So where's the right on this stuff? Because here in the U.S., the right is actually I would argue, at least as split as the left, or the liberal left anyway.
Yeah, the right over here is trying to avoid these issues, I think, because they are very split. Farage kind of embarrassed himself by jumping in too soon to back the Iran war and then retreated, especially because it was clear that reform was so divided over it and the wider right was divided. So he quickly retreated on that issue and doesn't even mention it anymore. Same with Badenoch, there's very little talk of it from the conservative leadership. They, I'd say the Tories are probably clearer on what they think about Ukraine, but the Iran war is a is a very difficult subject for them because their base is increasingly isolationist and increasingly suspicious of American and frankly Israeli influence at this point. You know, public opinion has changed dramatically in this country on Israel because of what Israel's been doing for the last 3 years. It's, I mean, that's again, go back to Streeting, big reason why his politics are changing on this, seemingly, is because Israel has quote unquote gone too far now, and it really is difficult to just close your eyes and pretend it's not happening. Um, in terms of right pressure, that's a good thing because it means that the split on the right favors favors the opening to the left, arguably, in terms of where the pressure can come from on Burnham. The British right is split three ways now between Farage, Badenoch, and Rupert Lowe. We won't get into Lowe in this episode, but another time maybe. Um, Reform being probably the most hawkish of those three initially, and now very sheepish on the subject, doesn't want to talk about it. Um, if if the Greens were smart, they would be putting Farage and other reform figures, putting their faces on billboards with the quotes of their support for the Iran war and just put those up in all reform areas. Again, it's something that deserves to haunt them, especially once the inflation hits.
Mm.
And that's an interesting point in this because Burnham is very much positioning himself as the guy who can fix the cost of living crisis. That has a foreign policy implication, which he
Absolutely.
which he may not be willing to explore right now, but he's going to have to confront that sooner or later.
Well, he asked for the job. Now he's got it. He may regret getting it. Uh, on that sort of gloomy note, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. This has been Globalists.